what we're doing today is looking at, we're starting the book club for The Conquest of Bread by Peter Kropotkin, and we'll be discussing this book in the coming weeks and just basically going through it, trying to learn from it, see what we can gain from it, what can we, expand our minds about, learn some of these new concepts, and see what we can do with things. So I guess we'll start off by getting into the sort of history and importance of the book, talk about sort of where it sits historically, where it sits ideologically a little bit, and then we'll go through those ideas. So, Peyton, what do you have to say here?
Yeah, so one of the really interesting things about the history of this book is actually that it originated or that it started off a little bit before the Russian Revolution and, obviously a little bit before World War One. And so the history of this book is quite interesting because Peter Kropotkin, later in his life, he had moved to England because he was born to sort of nobility, or born into, I should say, a wealthier, well-known family that had roots and tracing all the way back to the 9th century with the Vikings in Russia. But he had moved to London after, he had become an anarchist and he was persecuted. But at the announcement of the Russian Revolution, at the announcement of the possibility of actually establishing communism, he moved back to his country, and he ended up being disappointed in the reforms which were taking place, although he was optimistic initially, and then he died shortly afterwards. So it's an interesting history of the book because, there is an interesting history and background behind this book because he starts off oftentimes and, at being an anarchist, he's very critical of state socialism. And also, obviously, he's very, very, very critical of capitalism. And so that's the general outline of sort of that side of the history. The other interesting thing is that another very popular movement which was going on at the time was Russian populism. So this was a movement, of course, which brought up and thought to try to exalt sort of the peasants or the serfs over the corrupt landlords, the corrupt oligarchy, the corrupt political establishment, to use sort of modern lingo, that these people were the real oppressors out there. And Peter Kropotkin found himself, he was a sort of very well-educated person, again, from a relatively sort of high-born family, and he found himself in a situation where he began to detest his own position. He went for a little bit of time in government and absolutely hated it. He hated his time in government, and he began to come to the conclusion that there was no way to actually reform the state and to actually, sort of make life better for people by means of the state. He had initially moved, when his father was still alive, he had moved over to try to essentially to a sort of more liberal, you might say. I mean, the terms are a little bit anachronistic, but a little bit more of a sort of liberal part of Russia, and he was trying to implement governmental reforms in that direction. But then, shortly after the more conservative wing started to take over in St. Petersburg, it ended up being that the liberal part where he was at ended up getting crushed, getting defeated, and sort of wiped out, and so he had to end up returning home. And it was shortly after that he ended up moving into anarchism. You have anything to add there, Chris?
Yeah, so essentially that he did spend some time in prison and then ended up leaving prison, eventually ended up in London. So he definitely was in some different areas, exposed to some different stuff. And like you said, he was born into a sort of aristocratic family, spent some time in military school, eventually became an officer, it looks like. So he definitely, was exposed to lots of different things. And he, coming up in that I guess it's impressive when you see someone who grows up in the baby, basically well off, who's then able to turn around and be empathetic with those in society who are, maybe not doing as well as he could have if he had just sort of turned a blind eye and lived out the rest of his life living off what his family's position.
Yeah, and I mean, it is kind of interesting in the same way, or at least in a similar way. Bakunin, the sort of generation before Kropotkin, he also was born into not necessarily like a super high-born family, but also born into a more wealthy family. For instance, Bakunin's father served as a diplomat in Italy and in France. And so, there is a weird and interesting history of anarchists in Russia having roots to this slightly more well-off class and having some kind of connection to the monarchy. Peter Kropotkin, later in life, going back to Peter Kropotkin, described oftentimes his time in military school and talked about how when I believe it was the monarch of Russia at the time, I can't remember his name off the top of my head, came to at his, I'm not sure if it was at his graduation, but it was at some kind of speech at the school, and basically was cheering them on, saying that how they're the next future, that they're going to be the future of Russia and the like, but then says, and if you betray me, I will absolutely crush you, and goes on this long tirade about that, and that he remembers this very, very closely, that it's sort of seared into his mind. And when we're talking about the history of this book and bringing it to the history of Peter Kropotkin himself, one memory which was really important for him was that of his father. So he oftentimes, I mean, of course, he had a kind of endearing relationship with his father in some respects, but in other respects, he oftentimes felt disconnected from his father being a military officer, and him sometimes being a little bit more skeptical of some of those things. So one instance, for example, he remembers how his father was awarded a medal for going into either it was a burning building or a collapsing building to save someone, and he was awarded a medal. And for a long time growing up, Kropotkin Peter, he thought that his father had done this. And, he took some pride into that. He took some pride in the fact that his father was awarded a medal of hero, of valor, for taking this action. But then when he grew up, he came to realize that actually his father didn't even do it. It was one of his servants, one of his father's serfs or servants, someone that, his father basically owned. And when he confronted his father about this, his father said, well, he was my man. What's the difference? And he, right. It shattered Peter in many ways. It shattered him to have to face up to that, to realize his father wasn't exactly how he had envisioned him, and how this deeply connected to the oppression of serfs, to the oppression of slaves. And it was in that moment, and I'm sure in other moments, but this is sort of how he told the story himself, that it came to realize that there was a deep interconnection here between the oppression of serfs and a kind of deep misleading of the general public, and indeed a misleading of him, and that there's something deeply immoral, there's something deeply wrong in that side of things.
Yeah, it's a very interesting historical point there. And this book is held up by many. When you started getting into this area of politics, this book is frequently held up as one of the sort of pivotal or foundational books in this area. It's people bring up the historical impact. People talk about how it had a big impact on the Spanish Civil War, up to and even including the Occupy movement a few years back. Was leaders
Right.
with that movement were crediting this book and the ideas that were generated in this book. And, there are some, if you listen to critiques, there are some people who will say that many portions of this book are as relevant or more relevant than they were when the book was written. There's a few things that it sounds like may not have aged quite as well, but many parts of this book, you can view them in the light of today's society, and you can still see exactly what he's talking about. You can see those same nuances at play in modern society.
Yeah, and just one example of that you were bringing up there, the Occupy movement. Actually, it was the academic David Graeber. I have him here, referred specifically to Kropotkin as one of the leading and foundational figures of the Occupy movement, and talked specifically about the Occupy movement's, quote, anarchist principles or anarchist foundations, and talking about how Peter Kropotkin was the forefather, or one of the major forefathers, of not just the anarchist movement, but also specifically of the Occupy movement. Again, that's one of the leading figures in the Occupy movement, specifically crediting Kropotkin and this book most specifically. Kropotkin is known for his elegant writing, his clear writing, his interesting writing indeed. There's some interesting anecdotes from him when he was alive that people were oftentimes drawn to him because even though he would dress more plainly than many sort of people, having been brought up in that wealthier whatever you want to call it, wealthier family, he had the sort of mannerisms of someone who is a little bit more well off, of someone, from a kind of aristocratic background, because that was his background. And that led to a kind of mass appeal with him where people were oftentimes very attracted to him. He said that he had a very magnetic personality, and no doubt, in a weird way, his upbringing probably had something to do with that, because he would be dressed in much more plain clothing, much more simple clothing, but then he would act very elegant, very upright, in a certain sort of way, and that led to a kind of cross appeal where even people who were maybe a little bit more well off could at least sort of relate to him in a certain sense, could see certain things in him and maybe connect with him in a way that they couldn't typically connect with someone who, didn't act that way. Because, one of the things, I mean, that can sound very sort of, snobberish, but you do need to keep in mind, of course, that at this time, we're talking about people who were completely uneducated oftentimes. Like, the government didn't provide any kind of schooling. Society didn't provide any kind of schooling for the vast, vast majority of people. And so oftentimes the upper class looked down on, very much so, people who have, of poor taste or of poor manners. And so even though he dressed more plainly, he didn't act that way, and that led to him being more widely accepted, even again among people who may be more so a part of the middle class.
Yeah, interesting. That's an interesting a point to make there. Why don't we work through some of the themes throughout this book that we'll sort of discuss them at this point, and kind of see where we can kind of revisit these throughout the book, and then at the end and see what we think of them. So one of them is that capitalism inherently will lead to poverty, and then that poverty will inherently lead to what you could call wage slavery, right? So sort of if everyone is doing well in a capitalist society, then you can't force workers to work at a low wage, which is essentially the goal of capitalism, right? If you're the one who gets all the leftover, then you want to give as little as you can to the workers. You have to. That's the control that you would exhibit over them. So it sort of gets argued here. That's inherent in the system. You can't have a capitalist system that's fair to everyone. There has to be some unfairness for that system to move forward.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that's definitely one of the major themes which we do, which is going to be talked about in this book. Again, this is a book club, so neither of us have gone through and read the entire book. We've read parts. We've taken a look at parts of the book. We've, done research and background, but we're going to be going through and reading it with you guys. So we're going to be trying to explore and understand the themes for ourselves as we go through and read it. So some of the questions that I have, or at least some of the things that I'm hoping to get out of this book, having read, we're going to get to in just a second that we read the preface to the book, and so we're going to get to some of the themes and some of the ideas, but the preface was written after this book was actually done. I believe it was written in, what was it, Chris? Was it the year 1913? I'd have to go back.
I'd have to take a look.
Yeah, it was written in January of 1913, so it's
okay.
a few decades after the original book was published, and so he's sort of reflecting in some sense back on the book and adding a little bit perhaps to the arguments, and basically saying that, yeah, his principles, the general ideas argued in the book are still there. They still hold up quite true. And so from reading the preface, some of the questions that I have, I'm quite curious, first of all, and most obviously, how could such a society come about? How are we going to end up in this kind of world, right? Because the thing that he's really focusing in on is twofold, right? He's looking, for instance, at how science and how technology around the world has changed dramatically over the past couple years, and how that has led to new divisions of labor, and that new division of labor, i.e. the capitalist system, is now oppressing workers, right? Whereas he seems to think, if you go through and read the preface, again, we're going to look at it a little bit more closely in just a minute here, but he seems to think that historically, at least, there were many forms of socialism. He specifically refers to medieval societies, medieval townships, and that there were aspects of socialism quite deeply embedded. There were common ownerships, et cetera, and it was with the emergence of the state and coextensively the emergence of capitalism that those sort of what do you want to call it? I guess the communistic aspects, the socialistic aspects of society, that those things were then undermined, right? And it was, again, with the emergence of those things. And so it's sort of this emergence of new forms of society, new forms of ownership and the state, etc., is creating these kinds of things, new divisions of labor. So specifically, I'm interested in how such a society could come about, because
Right.
again, he's asking this question. He's asking this question in light of the new technological advancements. So as a result, I'm interested in how the division of labor can occur. And thirdly, quite curiously, I'm interested in this question of scientific positivism. How does he think about the relationship between science and society and science and the good life? Because he seems to think, on one hand, that society or that technology has advanced to such a state that it's creating this kind of wage oppression. But on the other hand, he seems to also think that science can liberate us from our goals. So I'm curious to get out of him
Right.
how science can interact in dialogue between those two things. That's something that I'm pretty interested in here. Anything for you, Chris? Anything else that you're pretty interested
Yeah,
in?
along those same lines, that's definitely a trail that I would like to follow. It seems that he does kind of call on science and call out, especially like in biology and ant colonies and
Mm,
different examples from nature where he says, look, you can see that there is a cooperative. They're working together. Even when you think about predators like lions, they're still cooperating in order to take down a zebra or whatever. So he's taking the stance that capitalism is like a very unnatural state of being, and then he's pointing out these cases where it appears that you can find cooperation in the natural world, and trying to make the case from a scientific standpoint that that is somehow more natural, which is a very interesting way of.
It's an interesting form of argument, and also it goes back again to his history. We mentioned how he was a military officer and how he served, in certain respects in the military in that way. But he was more specifically, in some respects, a scientist in the military. He spent his entire life. He was very interested in science. He kept up to date with all the new scientific discoveries, especially having deep interest in biology. We all know, of course, that this book was written in many respects in the aftermath of Charles Darwin's book. Now, what's interesting about Darwin's Origins of Species and his other works, including The Descent of Man, is that they were actually more influential in the social sciences and the social philosophies of the day before they became particularly influential in biology. While Charles Darwin did present very powerful evidence for his view, at the time of the publication of Origins of Species, it was not quite yet. Evolution was not yet established, like for sure, okay, we can say that this definitely happened. But of course, Charles Darwin provided a general framework for people to then go out and find new evidence. Of course, you think about it in the abstract, like the question of how did the origin of species ever emerge was oftentimes thought of as an idle philosophical dispute, something that you could never actually answer. But once Charles Darwin provided a framework, it allowed people to know what type of evidence they needed to search for. So anyway, what I'm getting to here is that oftentimes the social impacts of Charles Darwin's work preceded the sort of scientific aspects of it. And in many respects, Kropotkin's work here is an attempt to respond to some of the people who were taking Charles Darwin's work to argue for capitalism or for the state, that we needed to have a more predatory system of government or a more predatory system of society because, of course, it's survival of the fittest, et cetera, et cetera. And Kropotkin wants to reanalyze Darwin's work in terms of how the environment relates to the species and how individuals can, through one of the titles of his later work, Mutual Aid, can come together, how a species can come together in order to better combat the environment itself, as opposed to trying to think of natural selection as an argument or a debate between two people trying to find who's the best and who's the most fit. Kropotkin wants to reanalyze, sort of reshift our understanding of naturalism and of Darwinian selection to be more so a question of how the species relates to the environment as a whole. So another question, I suppose, that I'm interested in and want to sort of follow through this book as we read through it in the subsequent videos is going to be the question of how social Darwinism and how Kropotkin is in some respects responding to the work of Charles Darwin.
Yeah, that'll definitely be interesting to follow up on it and see what happens there. A couple other things that I want to look at, kind of set the stage to keep an eye on while we do this. One is this idea that humans left to their own devices will donate time and resources to creating things that everyone can benefit from. And I think a lot of times, in the United States, there's sort of this immediate reaction. Well, if I'm not getting paid, then then I'm not going to do anything, right? And there's been studies that kind of show this with kids. You kind of can throw things off once you start having an allowance that's specifically for doing chores. All of a sudden, you change the whole nature of that
Mm.
relationship and what the child's motivations is and stuff like that. So it's interesting to go through, and we can see that, right? Like most people have hobbies. You're not usually doing your hobby because you're getting paid for it. You're doing a hobby because it's something you enjoy. And oftentimes people can benefit from that. And on a larger social scale, I mean, many cities have free museums, right, where you can show up and you can enjoy all this art, and people are donating their time to work at those free museums and stuff like this. So this idea that if people believe in something, if they are inspired and motivated by something, they will put in free time and resources to making that thing be a benefit to the society as a whole, which I think sometimes is easy to miss in society if you're not really paying attention to it. So that was something that definitely
Yeah,
kind of
you
caught
mentioned
me.
there one of the studies about how work and the nature of work can change with monetary incentives. One famous study actually talks about how daycare, this is maybe a slight tangent here, but one famous study talks about how a daycare school implemented a fee when you come in late, basically, to pick up your they were having issues
Right,
with parents coming in late to pick up their children, and so they implemented essentially a fee, like, okay, if you come in late, then you have to pay money. Well, what ended up happening, of course, was that, maybe I shouldn't say of course because this isn't obvious, what ended up happening is that the lateness increased because people then
right,
began to view it as sort of a consequence of it. It's sort of, okay, well, I'm running a little bit late, I'll pay this money, I'm willing to pay the $5, $10, whatever it is, as
right,
opposed to previously they were relying on social incentives of lateness and of respect and of decency, and it turned out that the economic incentive didn't quite outweigh that. So that's one interesting study. Actually, another interesting thing is that if you there was a famous study done in Sweden as well, talking about how they went around and asked people whether or not they would be willing to it was basically, they asked them, would you be willing to have a nuclear power plant built in your neighborhood? It does believe that this might shorten your life by a certain amount. Now, this was all made up. This isn't true, but it was a poll test. They were just to sort of figure out the data. So they called people in a town saying, would you be willing to have a nuclear power plant built? It might shorten your life a little bit, but the nation believes that this is utmost important and that it can only be built there, et cetera, et cetera. And they ended up having a relatively high number of people. I can't remember the exact number off the top of my head, but they were basically saying, yeah, sure, if you're saying that that's the only way that this can happen, okay, I'm willing to take that hit and have that built in my community if it's for national goodness, whatever, whatever. And then they asked them, okay, but then we're going to pay you. They basically repeated the exact same spirit, wording everything else exactly the same, and then saying, and the government will pay you a little bit of extra money. It turned out that the number of people saying that they would be willing to do that actually went down when they offered
right,
additional money on top of it. So it's kind of an
right.
interesting thing there. So that's a slight tangent, but it's really some interesting stuff about how monetary incentives don't always work the exact way that we might think that they do. So anyway, let's go back to Conquest of Bread there. Chris, so do you want to?
There was one other thing I
Oh,
wanted to hit on before we move on. So, and that was that so one other theme that I kind of found very interesting was all human progress was created by all people, and so therefore should be shared. So everyone,
mm,
all the generations that lived before your generation have contributed to all sorts of things, inventing the wheel and inventing bikes and, all sorts of stuff that we as a society use and benefit from, and yet now we find ourselves in a situation where someone thinks they get to own all of that previous work. And one of the arguments here is that, well, really that was created by all people's efforts and so should be shared among all people.
yeah, and Chris, it's not just the sort of final physical thing that can be marketable that ends up contributing to a particular idea. We also end up in situations where various ideas, maybe perhaps mathematical concepts when you study mathematics as a child, such as the number theory, et cetera, that these sort of abstract ideas can lead to thinking about the world in a different way and can in fact shape your brain, right? We know, for instance, that depending where you grew up and the kind of education that you have, you can actually do brain scans and determine that the structure of the brain was different on the basis of the kind of educational upbringing that you may have had, the kinds of problems that you were introduced with. So various abstract concepts like the number zero, for instance, that was a very difficult concept to develop. But now, 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds can easily walk around grasping these abstract concepts like a number system system or a I mean, these are very abstract concepts, which you might imagine, and I think reasonably to say, are very important and necessary to develop things like the wheel or even bikes, bicycles, et cetera, et cetera. And all of these things are a kind of common ownership. So there is a sense in which even the most abstract things, even maybe the way in which we frame problems or understand situations in the world around us, that all of these things, in fact, shape the world around us. So I have someone in my chat here, Joe Jinks, talking about how he wants to mention that most societies in the past functioned on gift economies, literally an economic system which was based on giving and sharing of surplus resources. Yeah, that's absolutely right. And Kropotkin even brings that up in the preface. He talks about how previous systems and previous societies oftentimes relied on certain aspects of communal giving and certain aspects of communal societies, and that it was with the development of capitalism and the new systems of divisions of labor which came from that, which led to kind of oppression and led to people being oppressed out and led to certain people exploiting the majority of people for their wealth and for their resources. And you're definitely right there to point out that human nature is not static and that it changes and adapts to cultural elements. Yeah, that's absolutely 100% right. 100%. Yeah. Do you have anything to add there?
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point because I was kind of thinking about that earlier about how human nature sort of adapts to its cultural elements. Because when we, like Peyton was saying, we haven't read the whole book, but I've kind of read the beginnings to kind of get the sense of it, and then I've read about it. But I was trying to think what would happen if you tried to implement some of these into, say the United States. Right. And it seems like because of some of the cultural ways of thinking we have in this country, it might be very hard to adapt these ideas. I mean, there'd be a lot of rejection of these kinds of ideas outright, and it would be harder to get people to adapt some things. Whereas in another, if you try to do it somewhere else, you might have more willingness to adopt some of these kinds of ideas.
Well, and the beauty of that, though, is that culture isn't static either, right? You can work to change the culture. You can work to put in different ideas, sometimes even relatively abstract ideas like, hyper objects and, these crazy ideas that are coming out in mathematics nowadays, which can allow people to shape and restructure the way in which they think about physical structures in the current world. Like you can do things, what I'm trying to say, even relatively abstract things, to try to change the way in which people think and the way in which culture thinks about and the way in which culture shapes the world. They say that history is the story which one culture tells themselves. We can change our history. We can change the story that we tell ourselves, and that story can then shape, how we see our origins and how we see the world around us, even not just in the past, but moving forward too.
Right. No, that all makes sense for sure. For sure. Was there more you wanted to say about the preface to the book, or did you pretty much hit on what you were thinking?
Actually, no. So I haven't really gotten to the preface section of the book. I want to get to the preface section of the book. I was just sort of bringing up the background and the history of the book. You want to introduce sort of our channels and what we're hoping to get out of this book, and then we can go into some of the specifics about the preface, or?
Yeah, sure. We could definitely do that. So you want to go first?
Sure, yeah. So if you don't know, my name is Peyton Smith the Fourth. Yeah, no reason why you would know. Both of us have YouTube channels as well, small channels out there. I'm Fourth Radical on YouTube. Chris, you can introduce yourself, but Political Perspective on YouTube as well there. So we're sort of just hoping to get out of this book different ideas. We hope to do more than just this book in the future. We hope to take a look at different books, do book club sort of thing, and read different books, get different ideas, different tastes of ideas. And it's one thing to read books in person or sort of by yourself, but it's another thing to try to share what you're reading with other people. And I think there's something really fruitful about that. And I just want to do that. I want to experiment with that and see, because learning is a dialogue, right? Like reason is a public affair. Any thought, we're talking about how thinking is always related to these abstract ideas and our new thoughts moving forward are all related to old ideas. Well, that applies to the things that we're reading today. So if we can dialogue together and try to read these books together, I think we can all learn a lot more, and I think that it'll be quite fruitful. So that's what I'm hoping to get out of this. Chris, what about you?
Yeah, so I'm Chris Frederick. I have a YouTube channel, Political Perspective, where I do basically political-based news stories and go over those. But and then I've started streaming on Twitch just recently, same as Peyton. We're both just kind of getting started here on Twitch, and I wanted to be able to explore more than what I just the sort of progressive type stories that I do on my YouTube channel. Wanted to get into other things, maybe expand a bit, and I thought this was a good place to start. I mean, I've always, felt there were some pretty major flaws with capitalism in general. I mean, I think I could probably fill an entire, day-long stream just talking about all the different ways that capitalism lets us down in general. So, now kind of looking out there and saying, well, then what are the other approaches? What could be done differently? And trying to figure out, there's a few different ways things can be done, and trying to figure out what I think of those ways and maybe learn something from, Kropotkin and the other authors out there, and try to bring in some of their ideas and figure out what I like about those ideas and what I don't. So I'm definitely very open to this book. That's why I wanted to start off with it, and just sort of form a basis of if you don't have this trust in capitalism, what are the alternatives? And that's
Right. I
definitely
think we're
something that I
both.
want to go with.
Yeah, I was to say, I think we're kind of both on the same page in that respect. So, like, I've generally identified as a socialist for a few years now. Probably since I was in high school, I started to get those kind of inklings, like, hold on, maybe what we're doing isn't quite right. But I don't know the exact sort of brand. I don't know the exact sort of way to think about that problem. And so, exploring thinkers who have thought really hard about those ideas is obviously like a good starting point, not to just
Right.
think that, oh, I can figure everything out all by myself. Actually, no, it turns out that it's really important to offload intellectual thinking onto, other long dead people and see if you can learn from that. So that's sort of my hope with some of this as well. Um, anything else you want to add before we go specifically into the preface and
I
start
don't think so. I
splitting it
think
up?
that kind of sums up where we're coming from with this. Yeah.
Awesome. So, like we were mentioning earlier, when it comes to the preface was written a few decades after the main book. The preface was written in 1913, so again, a few years after the main book, and also just a few years before he passed away, before Peter Kropotkin passed away. So, in some respects, he's reflecting on his work, and in another respect, he's almost kind of trying to redirect his work. So, he opens up talking about how one of the major objections to communism, to socialism, is, and he does lump them together, at least in the preface there. Basically, he says that one of the major objections is, quote, that this idea is so old and yet it has never been realized. That's what the objectors oftentimes say. And he begins by saying, actually, this isn't quite right. And he says, well, first of all, it is true that sort of, for instance, there were Christian communes and there were various attempts of communism in the Middle Ages. But then he sort of redirects that problem by making a distinction between sort of pre-modern socialism and modern socialism, and he defines modern socialism by linking it to the new divisions of labor which arose out of the new factories which are arising because of sort of technological innovations. And he's saying that these new factories created a new working class. Whereas in the past, communism or socialism was all about sort of the common ownership of land, which he does point out was very common in the past and sort of in the Middle Ages. But what he does essentially concede, he says, quote, that the only thing which is said about communism, I'm trying to find the exact quote here. Here it is. The only thing which is said here is that modern socialism has not yet been entirely realized, and he also points out how modern socialism is not yet 100 years old. So this is a very new idea, especially when he's writing, and he's saying how this is a new approach, this is a new idea, and that this new approach, given the new technologies going on at the time, really changed the dynamic, really changed the way in which socialism was going to be enacted. Chris, do you have anything to add there?
Yeah, just that it's a very interesting point because obviously technology and advancements, we've come a long way technologically since this book was written. And so it almost seems like it takes those same ideas, but could in some way make them a little bit more complicated. So it'll be interesting to kind of trace through
Right,
the
because
book to think what would be the consequences of taking those same ideas but planting them in today's society what parts will still fit and what parts might have to be adjusted.
Right, because he seems to think that the new working class, what he's calling the new working class, is distinct and in some respects different, although oftentimes unified in their interest with the agrarian working class or with the farmers which exist previously. And he does seem to think that communism or socialism, or at least certain aspects of socialism, were very successful in those previous societies. And it was with the development, again, of the state and of capitalist instruments that those things were repressed, and those sort of common ownerships of properties were stolen from the workers, or from the, I should say, the farmers at the time there. So it's an interesting connection there between the emergence of the division of labor and the emergence of a kind of scientific worldview which was beginning to permeate society, or at least the technology was beginning to permeate society at the time. And he does seem to see the emergence of capitalism and the emergence of the state as connected. I think that's an important point to make.
Yeah.
Anything you want to add?
Yeah. Yeah, and it just seems like, back to kind of what I was talking about before, as you get more technology, it becomes easier for certain people to say, I own this technology, I own these machines, I own this, and so that you're sort of just locked into having that to do that work for me. You don't have much other choices, right? Mm-hmm. Like back to what we were talking about earlier, you keep wages low, people have no choice, then they have to do that kind of work. So it's this interesting idea that, to counter that argument by saying, well, actually, those machines and that technology was created by the people that came before that. My grandfather and your grandmother and all these people. That work is really still living inside of these machines that really should be shared by all of us.
Yeah, and I think that that's a really insightful criticism to make. Now, one of the things that I think is super interesting in the preface is that he tries to divide up the French Revolution into three different separate ideas. So I'm just going to read this little section here in the preface. He says here, quote, "It was first," referring to the French Revolution, "about the equalization of fortunes by means of an income tax and succession duties, both heavy and progressive, as also by the direct confiscation of land in order to subdivide it, by heavy war taxes levied on the rich only, and it was secondly an attempt to sort municipal communism as regards the consumption of some objects of first necessity bought by municipalities and sold by them at cost price," that's important there, "and it was third an attempt to introduce a nationwide system of rationally established prices for all commodities." So he's arguing, and then he goes on to talk about how those three ideas, the three pillar ideas, what he's calling the three pillar ideas, I imagine that different people would dispute what the three pillar ideas of the French Revolution are, but he's arguing that those are the three pillar ideas of the French Revolution, and that all three of those ideas are deeply rooted in socialistic aspects. What I find interesting about this is that all three of those, in many respects, especially I should say the first one and the second one, are deeply related to this question of scientism, or not scientism might be the wrong word, but again, sort of scientific positivism that I was mentioning earlier. The first one about the equalization of fortunes through the progressive income, through the income tax and through progressive taxation. And then the third one, they're talking about developing a nationwide system of, quote, rationally established prices for all commodities. One of the things that is really interesting is that the progressive income tax, we like to think that this was an idea which, maybe always existed, but one of the things you need to understand is that it wasn't until the development of statistics that the possibility of implementing a progressive income tax even became possible. So we had to develop mathematical systems firstly, and then secondly, there had to be a way of collecting this kind of data, which is actually super interesting. And the French data actually goes back the furthest and the longest. And part of the reason why France became so upset about the disparities in income is because France had the best collection of data about wealth inequality. Some of their inequalities wasn't always, necessarily, dramatically worse than other countries, but French people were more aware of their own inequalities because they had the collection mechanisms in place to collect those things. And again, that was developed on the back of the implementations of statistical methods, which were still relatively new at this point. And again, we're talking about here the method of developing rationally fixed prices. This, of course, goes all the way back to the Middle Ages, the idea of developing a just price. That was much of the work of economics and during the Middle Ages, and it was actually quite complicated work, trying to establish sort of by rational means what a just price would be. And this was, of course, an interesting thing which got brought into the modern era, modern period of things. And it led to interesting things. So, for instance, we know in the French Revolution, they tried to, they came to the conclusion, well, we don't know if we can quite establish a just price for specific commodities or for specific things. But what we might be able to do is redevelop and establish rational methods for measurement. So, developing different kinds of ways of measuring temperature, measuring weight, et cetera, in ways which would be more fair. At the time, of course, since there were multiple different sort of municipalities, different principalities, they all used different measurement systems, and that oftentimes led to exploitation of the poor. And so one way they thought they could try to counter that was by developing unified systems of weights and measurements and enforcing them in a single way. And they wanted those systems to be entirely rational. So, we know, for instance, like the development of like the Celsius method, where, the 0 degrees is set with the freezing point and 100 degrees is set with the boiling point of water. Now, you could argue that those points are very rational because, it just sort of makes sense. But in some sense, it is still like arbitrary, like why water? And also, by the way, it's water at a certain height, right? That if you bring water up to, a certain height, then it,
right.
Those degrees and those angles change. What is maybe
Pressure
rational about it?
Yeah.
What is maybe rational about it is that it's by tens, which is, of course, the basis of our number system. But, of course, there's other ways to divide up another number system. So, anyway, that's maybe a bit of a tangent there. But there's an interesting connection there, which Kropotkin lays out there between, again, just prices and sort of attempts to redistribute land. One interesting tidbit about the history of the French Revolution and how they tried to redistribute land is that they often sort of alternated between two different methods of determining who did or did not own land. There was a historical method and there were linguistic methods. So the linguistic method tried to look at various kinds of loads or corvées, which were different kinds of documents which were used at the time to sort of transfer land deeds between people, right? And so the first method tried to look at the historical origins of the land and try to determine whether or not the original acquisition of that land was justified. Now, they ran into, of course, a lot of problems. They ran into, of course, first of all, forgeries, but then they also ran into problems where someone may have legitimately acquired land, or at least what they would have considered legitimately acquired land through purchasing it. Maybe they were a laborer, and then they saved up their money and then purchased the land from their grandfather, but they didn't actually have the official documents, or they lost the official documents, and so people were losing their land unjustly, and some people were getting to keep their, some land, people who everybody knew were actually wealthy landlords who is, whatever the French Revolution would have said, no, you don't get to own your stuff anymore. We're getting to keep it because they were able to forge it. And so they switched to a linguistic method. And this method tried to determine whether or not you were justified in being able to, sort of have that land, whether or not that load or corvée was justified on the basis of how the wording was done in the document, right? So this idea tried to look at, well, is it using sort of high-born kind of French language, the sort of fancy language and the like, and what can we trace the origins of various words to certain time periods, et cetera, et cetera. But the problem with that ended up being, funny enough, is that basically, people would use or try to use sort of high-born French language when they would purchase something because it seemed more prestigious, right? Like, so, you're maybe just a carpenter or something, you saved up your money and you bought maybe a windmill on a particular whatever after, 20 years of saving or something, and then it led to situations where even those workers might end up losing that landlord or that land title because in their corvée, in their load, it ended up being that they used sort of fancy language in order to sign the deal because it was sort of they wanted a kind of fanciness with this thing because they were proud of it or what have you, and for various cultural reasons. And so, again, this goes back to the idea that the French Revolution was trying to reestablish politics on a rational and indeed scientific basis. So it's quite interesting to me, at least, how most of Kropotkin's analysis of the French Revolution breaks it up into three different socialistic elements, but all of those socialistic elements seem to have this idea of rationalism or rationality built into it in its relationship with society. And I don't know, I just find that to be quite interesting. Chris, I don't know if you have anything to add there. That's maybe a bit of a long-winded speech.
No, I think you summed it up pretty well there. I think you did good with that. Is there anything else to add before we sort of set up next week?
Let me I think, I mean, do you have anything else to add in terms of specifically the preface here?
I don't think so. I mean, he kind of set the stage for, where he's going with,
Mm.
where
I
the
will
book's going to go, but I think you got it pretty
I
good.
will say one other quick thing before before here. He concludes the preface by specifically talking about how he claims right that the evidence has been going up on his side since writing the book. Again, he wrote the preface a few decades after the original book, and he talks about how quote, even though it, referring to the nationalizations of certain industries, even though it resulted in the cheapening of a given commodity, it was often found that a new obstacle then emerged to the struggling of working men, today we might add women, for their emancipation. And so I think that it's interesting there how he sees in the nationalizations of even his own time developing new obstacles for the working class, and I find that to be interesting, right? Because he completely concedes at the beginning that it led to the cheapening of a commodity. It led to cheaper goods being developed, but he still seems to see struggles in the obstacles. So a question that I had when I'm reading that, well, what obstacles? Because he doesn't quite specify it, at least in the preface. So again, I'm at least going to want to follow through with the rest of the book and see what new obstacles he is seeing with the emergence of the nationalization of the various industries and what those obstacles for the working class are. What does Peter Kropotkin see as those obstacles, and do those obstacles still exist in the modern world today? Because again, he basically just says new obstacles emerged for the working class, but he doesn't exactly explain what those obstacles are. He does go on to say that, for instance, the national property of a railroad network, quote, could be much better handled by a federated union of railroad employees than by state organization. But again, he doesn't exactly clarify what the obstacles were for the working class. So that's going to be a question that I'm hoping to have answered for me in the coming chapters. So,
Right, yeah, all of these are great questions that I look forward to diving into and learning more about as we move through the chapters in this book. Absolutely.
yeah. So next time around, we're going to be taking a look at, was it chapters 1 through 3? Is that a good
Yeah,
break? Yeah.
chapters 1, 2, and 3 they kind of go together,
Yeah,
so it makes sense we
and
talk
that
about
sounds
those.
like a lot of reading if you all are interested in reading along, but actually it's not all that much. It's like maybe 15 something pages depending on what book you have. So it's actually pretty short. It's pretty easy. We'll be meeting again next week to chat about chapters 1 through 3. So just a few pages if you all are interested. So there you
Yep, and
go.
feel free to hit that follow button so you'll be notified when we're up talking about it again. We'd love to have people back and contributing to the conversation and sharing your ideas with us as we discuss the book next time.
Yeah, for sure. We'd love to have you around next time. So see you all in the
All right,
next
thanks
one.
everybody.